Well, thank you very much, Tom. I'm rather hoping they don't keep that poll running while I'm speaking. It would be slightly distracting, I suspect. Look, good morning, everybody. And can I start by giving my general thanks to the AIC. I've been a minister for 16, 17 weeks, but over the last 5 years, I've been shadowing the post. And throughout that time, Robert, you and your colleagues have been really, really helpful, really constructive, positive. I've learned a huge amount from you, and I will continue learning from you. And can I thank all the members present? It's a huge range of expertise from across the industry, across the sectors, and again, very, very important event. And can I also I'm going to describe Robert as my friend, Robert Goodwill. Different politics, I think it's probably fair to say, Robert, but I was very, very pleased to see you at the dinner last night. I can't imagine what you said, or perhaps I can imagine what you said, but you may be surprised to hear some in the audience that politicians can reach across the aisle, so to speak. And Robert interrogated me pretty aggressively when we were discussing the Agriculture Act, but we've become firm friends over the years. I'm delighted to see you here this morning. Look, let me start by acknowledging the anxiety that's felt right across the sector about the announcements in the budget. I'm not going to go into the details this morning, but what I can tell you is there's constant discussion going on. There are a number of key organisations in the room, and they will, I'm sure, reflect on the fact that we are in discussions to try and get a better understanding of how this is going to pan out. The top line I'd like you, though, to think about is that £5 billion that we've secured for the agricultural budget for the next 2 years. Because I think there were many people in advance of the budget who anticipated that wouldn't be the case. And I think it should send a strong signal to the entire sector that the government's absolutely determined to work with you on these issues and to put money in to make it happen. It is actually the largest budget for sustainable food production and nature recovery that we've seen in this country. And it wasn't easily secured, I have to say, because the overwhelming thing I'd also like you to reflect upon is the fact we don't have to go into the reasons as to how we got there. The nation's finances were not in a good state, and they had to be addressed. They absolutely had to be addressed in the interests of everybody, including all your businesses, because we could not carry on as we were. And that was always going to involve hard, difficult choices. And people can debate whether they were the right choices, but my party was elected on a manifesto, and I stand firmly with the Chancellor on the decisions that she has made. But what we have also announced in that budget is a very firm commitment to the agricultural transition, which was started by the previous government. That big commitment to the environmental land management approach, an extra £500 million into SFI, I think is a strong message again. And I've had people saying to me, what's the future look like? Well, the future looks like that, frankly. The future looks like a transition to a nature-friendly, environmentally way of producing food in this country over the next 20, 30 years. And you'll be hearing more from me and from my Secretary of State over the next few weeks as to how we envisage that happening, but also starting that dialogue with you. The legislative framework is set. We've inherited that from the previous government, but the biggest challenge to me was, before the election, was to ensure stability. And that's what I've tried to do through that process of getting the money and making the firm commitment that we're continuing that transition. Now, alongside, there were some who thought we wouldn't honour the pledge made by the previous government to compensate farmers who had struggled through those awful floods. But we did announce that money, and it's going out now, the £60 million. Plus, it's very hard to have any discussion at the moment without reference to the biosecurity threats. Obviously, people have struggled with blue tongue. We had avian flu really badly. Sadly, we have another case now. So that investment in Weybridge and the biosecurity facilities, the £200 million that was announced in the budget, again, is a very, very clear signal that we are serious about tackling those threats. But as I say, there was a difficult inheritance, so I don't underestimate the challenges the Chancellor faced. Now, on agricultural property relief, there is, I think it's fair to say, a disagreement about the figures, and we're working with others to try and understand why the figures look so different. But I'm confident that the figures the Treasury has, because they are the ones, quite frankly, who actually administer the system, are a very strong starting point for working out what the future implications should be. I don't, as I say, in any way underestimate how nervous and anxious people feel by genuinely think if you're running businesses, it is probably sensible to think about the future and to work out how you're going to plan for succession. And if this drives a further discussion in many businesses, and I have to say in some families, while that might not always be a welcome discussion, I think it will be a sensible discussion to have. And that may be one of the positives that can come out of this. But let me not shy away from the point. Government has to raise money for all the things I'm constantly being asked to do. And that's the Chancellor's responsibility. Now, moving on from that, our other top line has been about food security. My job title is not Farming Minister, actually. It's Minister for Food Security and Rural Affairs. And that was a deliberate choice because we absolutely recognise in the very challenging global geopolitical situation, the world is not as it was 10, 20 years ago. Food security really, really matters. So that is why I'm so pleased to see your report, and I have a copy of it with me, and I will read it closely later. I've had a chance to skim it. It's absolutely key, because without you, we cannot achieve that outcome. So alongside that, we also know the world is changing and has to continue to change. Innovation, absolutely critical. And we want to work with others, because it's not just from Defra, from my department, it will be other government departments that really establish, and well, not so much establish, I speak as someone who represents Cambridge, we're part of the country where innovation is absolutely key to everything we do, but we want to make sure that this country is the best place for innovators to start and grow their businesses, with access to both domestic and international market opportunities. And the development, commercialisation and adoption of agri-innovation, we think, has a key role to unlock future productivity in the sector. And that point about future productivity, I've been slightly surprised about some of the debate in the last week or two, as if somehow productivity didn't matter. Productivity really, really, really matters. And I know you know that, and I'm absolutely determined that we look for that in everything we do. And that will help us strengthen sustainable food production. And providing we can get the supply chain fairness, which again, to be fair, was instigated under the Agriculture Act by the previous government, but it's taken quite a long time to run through, make sure there's proper fairness down the supply chain. That will help us achieve that. Alongside that, and can I say how much I enjoyed Tom's book, you made many of these points. We've got a huge environmental and nature and biodiversity challenge as well. And that's why the environmental land management schemes are so important. And that's also why I very much welcome your report on sustainable efficiency. Both those points, as I've already made, absolutely key. Let me turn to a few more detailed points. Fertilisers, been quite a lot of talk about that in the last few days as well. We absolutely know how critical it is that you've got access, affordable access to those fertilisers. Third, I'm told, up to a third of growers' input costs. And we also, sadly, of course, know that the production of inorganic fertilisers is a significant contributor to those greenhouse gas emissions we have to be aware of. And we also know that not everyone is always using them as effectively, although I have to say my experience of most farmers is they're very, very aware of the high cost. But we also have to look, and this will be another challenge we have to face, at what we know is unacceptable runoff into our rivers. The public is absolutely focused now on water quality. We've seen with the water industry that there's a lot of attention on that. Well, we're going to have to get our sectors act together on that as well. And I know that's challenging, not easy, but we've got to make sure we do it. Again, innovation, I think, will help. Also, of course, we can look at fertilisers made from non-conventional materials, such as waste, which could really, really have an impact. So innovation, key to making the changes. Defra, my department, in the past, and we'll continue to support this, has commissioned research into these newer products, and we absolutely want to make sure and work with you, and there are many research institutions in the room that I can see, work with you to make sure that that process continues. Now, of course, some of these matters, and I can see colleagues from other parts, or from outside England, these are devolved matters. And any policy or regulatory decisions that we make will have to be considered as part of our Four Nations approach with the Fertilisers Common Framework. Now, we know, and of course you will see there's interest this week with the COP29 discussions going on, people are looking very closely at how we can meet these challenges. Agriculture represents around 11% of total UK greenhouse gas emissions, and methane emissions from livestock make up around 60% of greenhouse gas emissions from UK agriculture. We know there's work that's being done, that feed products can reduce the amount of methane. Again, I think a very exciting area of added value innovation with the potential to deliver significant outcomes for climate. So I'm pleased that several products are already authorised on the UK market, including both feed additives and feed materials. And we absolutely welcome the work AIC is doing as a vital part of our methane suppressing feed products industry roundtable. So I am an optimist on these things. I think we can use science and innovation to tackle these very, very serious challenges. We also have the Food Standards Agency, of course, involved, and they provide evidence for the GB Register of Feed Materials, which paves the way for further utilisation of high efficacy and safe methane suppressing feed products. Now, on plant protection products, and again, I can see colleagues in the room who I've had many discussions with over the last few years. Turning to horticultural and arable sectors, the government is absolutely committed to supporting farmers and growers in controlling pests, but doing it in the sustainable way that we're talking about. And that will involve the development and adoption of new biopesticides and, of course, the application of integrated pest management and targeted monitoring and application of these technologies. And some of the farm payment offers that we're making, particularly through SFI, are for a combination of integrated pest management and precision farming actions, which we will continue to encourage people to take up. You'll also know, many of you I suspect, that a few weeks ago I announced our intention to take forward the precision breeding regulations. That will be subject to parliamentary time, but it will be as soon as we can do it. And I genuinely think there are real opportunities there which will not only transform the regulatory environment, which will, I think in turn will attract investment and innovators, but we can see some really important goals on the near horizon now to deal with some of the challenges we've got very much in this part of the country. And investment in the crop genetic improvement networks will be part of that as we support research. I've watched over the last decade from Cambridge the extraordinary progress in terms of the agri-tech sector, and there are people in this part of the country who have played a leading role in that. And I think that should really inspire us as we look ahead. I was talking to Robert and others earlier about the fact that you as an industry, you need a view for the next 10, 20, 30 years to make it investable. It's going to change. It's going to be different. It's not going to be the way it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that's what we've got to work together to set out plans which allow people to look ahead with some certainty. But I think what we can say for sure today is it's got to be a more sustainable agri-food chain. We've got to translate some of these great ideas that we see being developed in and around this part of the world into real-world practice. And we've got to make sure that private investment and inward investment can come to support this, because government has a role, but it can't be just about government. We also need to make sure the regulations are fit for purpose, they're proportionate, and that they're going to create that right environment that people can have confidence in and invest. And a minor point perhaps at the end of all this, we've also got to have the right workforce. There are a whole range of issues around that, of course, but we've already made announcements that I hope in good time have given people confidence for the year ahead. We also need to make sure that people have the skills. So things like the Institute for Agriculture and Horticulture, again, which has been developed over the last few years, we think will help provide the kind of tailored advice and practical tools that should help farmers run the successful businesses and everyone in the supply chain to thrive. So my message in conclusion, Tom, is we want to create the conditions for investment and economic success. I know that may sound like a curious thing to be saying today, given that people are anxious about the post-budget period. But I think when people stand back in a few years' time and look at what had to be done in this transition from what has been a very difficult decade, it's not a party political point I'm making here, it has been a difficult decade in terms of instability and change. What we've got to do is settle it down and actually get a longer term view. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you in this room, but particularly with AIC members, to help establish that proper framework which will allow us to work together to achieve the success I think we all know. And I think I was encouraged by that poll at the beginning, because I share your optimism for the future. Well, I'm absolutely determined we're going to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, Minister. And we're joined also on stage by Robert Sheasby for this discussion, Chief Executive of the AIC. We've got a nice raft of questions coming in here, but I'm afraid I'm going to use a little bit of Chairman's prerogative and start myself. You said that you want to see this growth in productivity and investment and everything, but I'm thinking what most farmers are seeing is ways that money's being taken out of their industry, whether it be changes in national insurance, changes in the minimum wage, and of course the tax changes that you mentioned. So where's the actual action from government that's backing up your aspiration to get more productivity and investment in this business?
Well, let me take you back to the biggest investment this country's ever made in this sector, £5 billion over the next 2 years. And that is taxpayers' money. It's there for a purpose. And that, I would say, is a big vote of confidence, because the Chancellor had to make some pretty big decisions as to how we were going to go forward. And I tell you, if we'd done some of the things, not that people are suggesting alternatives, but there are a whole range of really unpopular things that would have suppressed demand. And what we need to do is make sure, remember, living standards in this country have barely improved over the last decade, which is extraordinary.
But that money is primarily for public goods. That's what I said. It's not there for the business of farming. That's pretty much explicit. So I'm just wondering again what the actions have been to help the business of farming grow, become more productive and attract more investment.
Well, let me take you again to the other point that I was making, the money that we absolutely are happy to pay to help people through the floods that they suffered last year. Now, let me be frank about this. This is not something we can necessarily continue to do in future. We've got to have a sensible discussion about how we share risk, how we manage risk. But of course, when you look at the extreme weather events we're facing, that is why it's so important. I'll take you back to some of the points you make in your book. So important that we address these challenges sensibly. But there's no magic money tree. There's no huge pot of money that's out there. If there was, it would be wonderful. But we've got to get the public finances into a sustainable place to give people the confidence to build for the future.
And just going back to your flooding point, the way we farm and indeed manage land can do a lot to alleviate the impacts of flooding. Robert, just from your point of view, I mean, from what you've heard from the Minister, what do you make of it in terms of encouraging these things for your industry, this, getting more value into the agri-supply chain?
Clearly, the conversations we've had with members since the budget 10 days ago have focused a lot around that's concern around the changes to BPR coming in, what that means for family-owned businesses there, as well as concerns that other organisations, the NFU, etc., are raising on APR. But I think the biggest disappointment I've got from members is it was a lot of talk about building a budget for growth, to grow the economy. And that came through the narrative strongly, but the content of that statement from the Chancellor hasn't inspired business to think about growth. And I think it's how do we get back to a place where business is thinking positively about investment and growth. And I don't know how we navigate these next 3 months, 6 months, whatever it may be, to get to a place where we're more positive.
Let me suggest how exactly we navigate the next few months. Over the next few months, you're going to hear a whole series of proposals rolled out, particularly around things like the National Land Use Framework. Now, one of the strongest messages we've had from business over the last few years is the planning constraints are a constant problem. And what you will see over the next few months are measures to address those issues. We absolutely get that we cannot continue in the way that we have been. So I'm afraid, I think a lot of these things should have been addressed over the last decade. They weren't. That is what we are suggesting is the way to give you that. In the end, government is not going to be running this industry, nor should it be. But what we can do is put the measures in place to allow people to prosper and succeed. And I think if we can get that set out, and some of this is going to be done in dialogue with you. There's no silver bullet. But when one looks at the huge energy transition that's going on, for instance, there are huge opportunities there. but it needs to be done in a sensible way. So that is what we will be setting out over the next few months. And I'm genuinely sure that in engaging with you, we will be able to set out that framework which will allow people to prosper. So that's the answer to your question.
Okay. We've long asked for a national land use strategy. I think something that engages at the full level.
Rumour has it due out either side of New Year, maybe? Not the strategy, so the launch of the consultation for the framework?
Look, I mean, this was announced by the previous government in response partly to Henry's excellent work from a couple of years ago. And I think I remember sitting at the Oxford Farming Conference 2 years ago in a meeting with the civil servant who was charged with doing it, thinking, this sounds like a big job, a really challenging job. And it doesn't surprise me, it's taken quite a long time. It didn't surprise me entirely, despite constant announcements by the previous government it was just about to happen, that it didn't happen before the election. But what I can tell you, I mean, I've seen the first draft, and it will be soon.
Soon. That catch-all. Just before we move on, just one on tax, if I may. You said the Treasury's figures were a useful starting point for this inheritance tax threshold. Sounds to me like you think that might change, or maybe that was put in a bit wrong at the beginning. Are we going to see that threshold move up?
No, you're not.
I don't know, 2 million, 3 million?
No, Tom, we're not going to see any change because the budgets are set. Certainly, for those people who, and we were talking about this earlier, the whole process in Parliament is a lengthy one because there's a finance bill that follows, and these always when policy changes are introduced, they have to be, the detail has to be designed. So what has disappointed me is that people have jumped to a series of sort of extrapolations as to what will happen rather than looking at the actual figures of what has actually been happening over the last few years.
Well, that's because of a lack of clarity. That's
well, there's no lack of clarity.
Filled that void.
There's no lack of clarity. The figures are as they are, and people can look at them. But people have, and I understand why people do this, but I'm afraid there's a huge discrepancy in the figures from the actual claims on estates, which the Treasury has administered in recent years, and some of the figures that others are using. And our officials are working on that because there must be reasons why there are those disparities. But what I also say is this is an extremely complicated area of inheritance tax and business planning. And certainly I spent hours answering questions in the House of Commons over the last week or two. And what struck me was that there were very few people in the room, I think, who are qualified to talk in detail on this. And what I do suggest is that people go away and look at what has been said by some of the people who are qualified. I can refer you back, for instance, to the discussion on farming today last week. And when you get to the people who are actually looking at the detail, what they'll tell you is, yes, it will require behaviour change in some cases, but with that behaviour change, they believe that it will be relatively few people who are affected. And that is the message I would like to put out to people, to reassure people. Of course, I quite understand why my political opponents might want to say something different. That's it. We live in a democracy. It's perfectly reasonable for people to say stuff. But please look at the detail, look at the actual figures, and I think a different story emerges.
Right, let's move on to some of the questions from Slido for Minister Zeichner. From Helena Horton, I don't know if she wants to make herself known. She's put her name on here. Is the government planning a free trade deal with Donald Trump, and will it include food and drink? And how will that protect? What will the impact be on farmers? So what's agriculture's response to Donald Trump's election?
Well, thank you, Helena. Good try. Look, obviously what we will do is we will continue to pursue agreements with countries across the world that are interested in this country, but what we will never do is move away from the very high standards that we have in this country.
Okay, you don't want to talk about whether, if they do put up tariff barriers, will we be responding or anything like that?
Well, look, it's all hypothetical at the moment, isn't it? We don't know what's going to happen, but our view, and I think it is the sensible view to take, is that we will always pursue the interests, the national interests of this country. But clearly, we will have a trading relationship with a number of countries. In fact, I was very pleased only a few weeks ago to be celebrating the fact that we now are able to export beetroot. I was at G's in Ely, just down the road, holding, and you can see the picture of me clutching beetroot against the background of Ely Cathedral, because thanks to the excellent work of our agricultural attachés, we have secured that agreement. And that is the kind of approach that we will be taking.
Very good. I hope your advisors didn't panic too much about potential headlines with beat and cathedrals in the background. It was all fine. Very good. Would the Minister care to address a recent comment made by John McTernan, who's an advisor to Tony Blair, when asked about potential farmer protests about tax changes, who said, "We don't need small farmers"?
Well, John's wrong, and he doesn't speak for the government.
So do you think that undermines confidence in government policy?
Well, there are lots of commentators out there who say things, but John does not speak for the government, and he's wrong, because small farmers, the entire farming sector, is crucial to the future of our country. And I think what strikes me, and what I've learned over the last 5 years, obviously I spent most of my life in Eastern England. When you go to the southwest, when you go to the uplands, when you go to Northern Ireland, when you go to Wales, what you see is it's very different in different places. And that is part of the complexity of this. And devolution, of course, has meant that we have different approaches in the different nations. That's right and proper. But what has always struck me also is that the farming community isn't just about food production. It's at the heart of rural communities. And I very deliberately, when I was negotiating my job title, said I want to be Minister for Food Security and Rural Affairs, because it disappointed me that over the last decade, quite often, it's not a criticism of the individuals, but quite often rural affairs seem to have got shunted off into the House of Lords. It's interesting that just earlier this week we had probably the first really big debate on rural affairs for a long, long time in the Commons chamber, called by a Labour government.
Yeah. And Robert, just on the sort of family farms, small farms thing, there's often a lot of sort of, I'd say, media and indeed political praise for that sector of farming. Is that really where the future of farming lies?
I think UK farmers are delivering at every scale, Tom. So it's about ensuring everybody's got the chance to prosper. And there is an issue that those family farms are worried about their future. But actually, every business is worried about its future. Yeah. There's changes coming through, whether it's national insurance changes, challenges on trade, fluctuation in global stability, which affect everybody. And you may not see it day to day, but from a family farm to the larger farming businesses to the real niche. I remember seeing a watercress grower working under polytunnels up in Cheshire, an unusual place, but carved out a niche to grow a business that made a difference to the local economy. So it doesn't matter what scale you're at, we need everybody to producing food in this country. And Minister, with food security in your title, that's got to be the thing we're working on, is growing our resilience and making sure the food security of the country is in a good place.
Totally agree.
With food security in your title, would it be a failure if our proportion of domestically produced food went down?
Now you're tempting me again. Look, what we know, of course it is. Of course it is. Look, I was pleased under the Agriculture Act, and Robert will remember these discussions, that the government is bound to produce a food security report. We thought it should be done annually. Originally, the previous government wanted one done once every 5 years. We settled on 3 years, and the first one came out, I think, 3 years the day, or on the last day it was supposed to, and there'll be another one coming out, hopefully slightly earlier, so it can be discussed. And this whole question of food security has shot up the political agenda, and it means, to be honest, it means different things to different people. A lot of my colleagues will see it very much in terms of household food security and the huge rise in, essentially, food insecurity in this country, and it is shocking that we have to rely on so many food banks. I absolutely take my hat off to the people involved. We really shouldn't need food banks in a wealthy economy like ours. But then I think for most of us in this room, we would see food security in much more global terms. So in answer to your question, I've always said that I want us to see us producing more food in this country. I think targets are tricky because, as we know, and we've seen it in the last year or two, obviously weather plays a huge role, and you can't always guard against that, but you can take a 5-year view.
I'm really intrigued though. So you want us to produce more food in this country. You mentioned earlier that you want to see greater nature in this country and reduce carbon emissions as well. Do you think those things are deliverable? And is the key to that a word that I didn't actually hear you mention, which was regenerative farming?
Well, regen, I mean, I strongly support, I think most people strongly support, but of course definitions are tricky around that. I was at Groundswell a couple of years ago and I was struck by the enthusiasm, and I'm struck by the enthusiasm right around the country. So yes, absolutely a role, but there will be many approaches that can be taken, and they will depend upon local and individual circumstances, and also the support we can give.
And to the first point of the first question that I put in there was, do you think it is possible to produce more food in this country whilst enhancing nature and indeed cutting carbon emissions?
I absolutely do, and that goes back to my point earlier about productivity, which I don't think has been talked about nearly enough. I mean, clearly there is a huge debate around land sharing, land sparing, and so on, and many learned reports have been written by Royal Society. Henry again touched on it in his work. But I genuinely think, and when you look at some of the proposals, obviously they were knocked back, some of the vertical farming proposals by high energy costs a few years ago. But when you look at what innovators are coming up with and what the future looks like, I don't think there's any doubt that we can do this. But we do need to pay more attention to some particular sectors, such as horticulture. We do not grow enough fruit and vegetables in this country.
Just while we're getting the mic to a lady over there, but can you keep your hand up, please? Thank you. Just while we're getting a question here that's very popular. Biological controls are not being brought forward in Great Britain as manufacturers find our regulatory regime too slow, too costly, and too small a market. Do we need to change this?
Well, there's quite a big question in there, and you will all know that this government has said that we want to renegotiate or improve our relationship with our near neighbours, the European Union. Quite clearly, quite a lot of the regulatory systems we have both been inherited and are now beginning to diverge. And just not through choice, but just because time is passing. And I very much appreciate the fact that for investors, that poses potential challenges. Now, without going over a debate from the past, we are where we are, but I'm charged by Keir Starmer with working with others to try and negotiate an improved phyto and phytosanitary and veterinary agreement, and we will be trying to achieve that. And there'll be a whole range of other things that come from the decisions that we make or are able to arrive at in terms of our relationship with the EU.
Something that could help boost the productivity and business of farming without spending a great deal of money, potentially, getting those regulations right.
Indeed, but we also respect the choice the British people made at the referendum. It wasn't my choice, but it's a choice that was made, and there are advantages, as we've seen, in terms of the fact that we've been able to move much more quickly on precision breeding.
There's a question of that, Ali, I think. Yeah.
Minister, Ali Kappa.
Yep.
Can everybody hear
Yep,
me?
yep. Go
Ali
ahead.
Kappa, I chair British Apples and Pears and Horticulture Crop Protection Limited. So thank you for your answer to the last question. Fruit and veg businesses need confidence and certainty, and you talked a lot about that, Minister. Right now we've got a generation of farmers aged 65 and above and their next generation, and that might be in a limited company or it may be in a partnership, who are facing a cliff edge due to the IHT changes. And it's the combination of APR and BPR that really is hurting our sector. What transition measures will you introduce to limit the human impact of these proposed changes?
Well, as I said earlier, I think there are many, many different circumstances that people find themselves in, and I'm not going to be giving individual advice to people, but quite clearly, if people they can make lifetime transitions with the 7-year, I can see you shaking your head, but certainly it can be done. There are ways in which this can be done, but I'm certainly happy to look at figures that people can bring forward to show me what the challenges are with that. So we will have ongoing discussions, but genuinely,
might
I
there be
would
some
ask
shaving in of this?
the question. I suppose I would still go back to the point I made right at the beginning, which is the number of estates that are currently claiming this relief is relatively few, and that's why we need to understand why the points that you are making do not seem to tally with the figures that we have from the Treasury about what is actually being claimed at the moment. So let's have further discussion.
Thank you. Just one last one from Slido, and it does overlap a little bit into the land use framework you mentioned earlier. So the question is, will there be a national food and agriculture strategy for the UK to boost investment and economic growth in this sector?
Well, as I said earlier, I think what you're going to see over the next few weeks will be, and months, will be a series of announcements that will set out our plans, and not just our plans, but we hope very much the plans that we can develop with you and with others to set the path ahead for the next decades, I would say. Because, and I've made this point before, post-Brexit, there had to be a series of things. I acknowledge this because it was a major change to move away from the Common Agricultural Policy. The agricultural transition of that 7-year period was set out by the previous government. But it was never very clear, I think, to most people what the world was going to look like after that transition. And that's the challenge that we have now. And I think this is absolutely the time to be doing it at the start of a parliament, to work with others to make sure that people have got a clear idea. But I can give you the overall framework. We've already seen that commitment to that transition to an environmentally and nature-friendly form of support for farmers in this country to produce food. That is going to be the direction of travel in the future. That was why the £5 billion is in that budget for the next 2 years, and that's why you're seeing an extra £500 million in SFI. It hasn't come up this morning, but one of the things that I was really struck by when I walked into the department was the problem that had been identified for the last few years was low uptake of SFI. Suddenly it's completely changed. It's now big uptake of SFI. The challenge I've got is to make sure that we've got the budget to meet that, to give people the confidence to make that transition. So that's the way the future looks to me. What I want to do is have a discussion with you and others to make sure that we can make that work.
Just very quickly, please.
Yeah, Minister, on that land use strategy, that's a really welcome announcement. We look forward to hearing and engaging on that. But on the industrial strategy and the trade strategy, do we need to work with you to get an agricultural chapter in there to ensure that the Department for Business and Trade are also clear about where agriculture fits into the wider economy, supported by a land use strategy? Is that something we should be engaging
We
in?
are absolutely talking to colleagues about making sure that we fit within the industrial strategy, and both the life sciences sector and the advanced manufacturing sectors are both places where we fit very, very well. So we will be part of those broader strategies. There is a danger sometimes of government having many strategies, but the missions that the government has set out I think are broadly clear as to what we want to achieve for the country as a whole. But perhaps this is a good point upon which to conclude. There's one thing that is inescapable is we need to feed ourselves. And that is never going to change, which is why you have got an absolutely crucial part in our future. And in a globally, say, challenging world, producing more food here has got to be an important part of that. But it's also got to be done in a way that meets the environmental challenges. Otherwise, we are going to see more of those extreme weather events, which are so difficult to deal with. And we've got to do it in a way that respects nature and biodiversity, because without that, we can't produce food either. So it's a complicated mix of things. It's a fantastic challenge, but it falls to our generation to do it. And I'm pretty confident we can, but I need your help.
Minister, we could cover very much more, but I gather you've got a train to catch.
Sadly, I have others who want to interrogate me, you'll be surprised to hear.
But listen, please put your hands together and thank the Minister for the speech and the questions.